Donald Trump announces a trade deal with China after his meeting in South Korea with Chinese President Xi Jinping. President Trump, as he often does, calls it a 12 out of 10. How will we rate it? And what does it mean for the future of U.S. China relations? Plus, the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates by another 25 basis points on Wednesday, but signals maybe not another cut in December, as markets have been anticipating. Has the Fed given up too soon on its fight against inflation?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Those are the subjects for our Potomac Watch podcast today. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, and my colleagues, Alicia Finley here in studio and Joe Sternberg in his London abode, both of which follow markets and monetary policy. Welcome. Well, Donald Trump, as he usually does after a foreign leader declares it one of the greatest meetings in the history of summitry. He declared a trade deal with Xi Jinping a great success. Let's listen to the president on Air Force One on his way home.
I've agreed, as you know, I put a 20% tariff on China because of the fentanyl coming in, which is it's a big tariff. And based on his statements today, I reduced it by 10%. So it's 10% instead of 20% effective immediately. I believe he's going to work very hard to stop the death that's coming in. But again, it's complex because of what fentanyl is, what the precursors do. So I think you're going to see a big difference.
Well, a big difference in fentanyl. Joe, what are your expectations, not just on fentanyl, but what's your view of this overall deal?
Well, I think it seems to have been a lot of work over the past couple of months, basically to stand in place or even take half a step backwards. So, I mean, the first off, the big news that we haven't talked about yet is that the 100% tariff, which Trump had threatened to impose this weekend in retaliation for China's export ban on rare earth minerals, is not going to happen. So that is very good news. So we can all breathe a sigh of relief about that. You do have the reduction to 47% from 57% of the overall tariff rate that was currently being imposed as a result of this fentanyl-linked reduction in that part of the tariffs. The rare earth exports are going to flow again, at least for another year, although note that Beijing is now normalizing this notion that apparently this is something that we discuss every year.
Right.
There didn't used to be a deadline or a time limit on those exports, so this is a ratchet that they've introduced. And then also we're going to have Chinese purchases of American soybeans again, which is alleviating a big point of political and economic stress in the U.S. But you sort of look at this, and the key point about all of this is that what I have just described is essentially what the status quo was back in late April or May. So, we've had this enormous palaver about the rare earth export controls. We've had this 100% tariff threat and all of the uncertainty that introduced. Mm-hmm. We've had the fentanyl tariffs and the total rate of 57% and the damage that's doing to the U.S. economy and the damage that this is all doing to the Chinese economy. And we are now right back where we started before any of this began.
Yeah, that I think is a pretty good summary of things, Alicia. The main benefit here is, I think, that we're dodging a big, major economic dislocation from what would have been an accelerated trade war. The U.S. needs rare earths, but Xi Jinping has realized now he's weaponized those exports. This one-year reprieve is just that, a reprieve. And I assume there'll be a price to be paid every year now in next year that the U.S. will have to give China something in return for continuing the flow of rare earths. What about the export control issue? And whether there's been real debate over export of NVIDIA chips in particular, whether those should be controlled or limited. What's in this deal on that front?
Well, Trump is saying that they're giving very little away or nothing away at all. I think that's really debatable. In September, the Trump administration cracked down on the ways that some Chinese companies were using to circumvent the export controls on chips and other advanced technologies, basically by setting up some subsidiaries. Now, the administration has agreed to roll back those rules, essentially saying, all right, we will look the other way if you guys try to and run our export controls. So that is very much an easing of our export controls. What they did not do, or it doesn't appear they did, is they did not allow China or ease the export control on the new black gold chips. And these are highly advanced NVIDIA chips, their latest line.
NVIDIA is the great American
company, right?
Yeah, American company.
And Chinese AI companies and others want to get their hands on these chips. So do, by the way, American companies. There is a shortage of them. But he did say, what Trump did say is that, well, we're going to let NVIDIA and China, we'll let them talk it out and discuss, which is essentially implies that, well, they may also look the other way if there's some kind of deal that NVIDIA cuts with Xi Jinping. And recall that China's also been trying to restrict the sales of NVIDIA's less advanced chips in China to help its own homegrown companies like Huawei.
And remember that Trump cut a deal with Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, so that the U.S. gets 15% of the sale of NVIDIA's chips in China, correct? So
that's right, for their H20 or 20 chips, yeah.
Yeah, so Trump has a stake, if you will, a political stake from a revenue point of view in NVIDIA being able to sell those chips to China. What are the lessons here, Joe, of the whole trade war, trade confrontation with China? I'll start with one. I think one of the lessons I draw is that trade wars aren't easy to win. Like the president suggests, when you are dealing with a peer competitor, this isn't Bangladesh or Cambodia. China is a peer competitor. It has a lot of leverage itself, as we've learned with the rare earth leverage. And Trump has basically been, and China retaliated against the U.S. by the rare earth ban, as well as not buying a lot of American products it had been buying. And they basically stared Trump down to this third truce in the last year. And so, you can say who won, who lost, but it certainly, maybe both sides have lost something in the fight, and they're kind of going back to their corners now. But there's certainly no great victory for the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big lessons here is that you have to actually think through what victory looks like in a trade war. Because if you look at this purely in economic terms, I think that you can actually make an argument that, maybe to some of our surprise over the past year, the U.S. economy has turned out to be much more resilient in light of the Trump tariffs and all of the trade warring than we might have expected.
I think that's fair.
From that perspective, you can actually say if this were only an economic issue, maybe you can say the U.S. won. And conversely, I think that the Chinese economy is continuing to experience a lot of strain. Some of this far predated the second Trump administration. It goes back to various domestic developments there with the gradual deflation of the property bubble and the after effects from that. I think that the one takeaway for me has been that the Chinese economy in some ways has been much less resilient. But this isn't only purely about economic macro data or any of the rest of it. There's also a political element, and I think that one key fact here is that Trump was elected to improve the U.S. economy, to improve household sense of well-being, and particularly to get inflation under control, to get prices under control. Voters in the U.S. don't care if China is economically worse off as a result of the trade war in some regards. I think what American voters who are going to the polls in midterm elections a year from now care about is whether their own situation improves. And so I think one of the things that's been going on for the Trump administration is the dawning realization that they don't get any credit if they haven't delivered rising prosperity for Americans, and the trade war doesn't help that. So it doesn't matter if you're doing better in the trade war than China is, if voters don't feel that they are better off as a result of all of this.
Yeah, Alicia, to expand on that lesson, I think that Trump's motivation here overwhelmingly was to avoid a big economic disruption going into an election year with the midterms. So let's cut a deal on soybeans. That'll help in the Farm Belt. And let's avoid a big tariff brawl that would have disrupted markets. And even the tariff reduction for Trump must have been something of a disappointment to him, since he thinks that tariffs are virtuous in and of themselves as economic policy, and he's cut that on the fentanyl. But the fentanyl is important politically, domestically, but do you think the Chinese will follow through on this fentanyl thing?
No, I don't think we've seen any follow through. They cut a deal during the Trump administration, or the first Trump administration. Right. Nothing happened. The Chinese have shown no real interest in cracking down on their producers, in part because, well, I think they have an insidious motive, to keep Americans hooked on fentanyl. And so they don't really care. And it's very hard for the Trump administration to even try to enforce this kind of commitment. So I think that's a lot of window dressing. I mean, Trump thinks that the fentanyl really resonates. He used it also as an excuse to impose tariffs, recall, on Canada
and Mexico,
right? Even though almost no fentanyl crosses the Canadian border, but he used that, and I think, to try to increase public support for his tariffs.
Yeah, I think that's right. Fentanyl, he knows, does resonate with the American public as an issue. So seeming to do something about it is significant politically. Longer term, Joe. U.S. China relations. Everybody wants to avoid a war. At least certainly I do. I think most Americans do with China. On the other hand, they're an adversary, and they are looking to exploit our vulnerabilities whenever they can. That means cyber penetrations of U.S. critical infrastructure. That means sowing mistrust through TikTok and other ways that they can with the American public, and pressing for strategic advantage in the Asia Pacific. That's going to continue no matter what this trade truce does. And I think one of the lessons here, particularly on rare earths, is the West and the U.S. just have to get their act together and make the U.S. economy on such critical supply chains less vulnerable, less dependent on China.
Yeah. Now, one point to make at the outset: we've been talking about this agreement primarily in economic terms.
Right.
Important to remember that probably the best thing about this deal is something that is not in it, which is that there is no sign that Taiwan came up at all in the conversation between Trump and Xi, and Trump certainly did not bargain away American security, assistance, or America's interest in Taiwan's future as a democratic island as a cost of getting this deal with Xi. So I think that is good news. But the broader problem that you run into is allies would really help. I think that you mentioned the rare earth situation, Paul. This is an example where we are seeing evidence that actually alliances can be really useful. There's been the U.S.-Australia deal recently that is geared toward encouraging more rare earth production outside of China. There's potentially room for cooperation with the Europeans. I think in terms of the general security relationship and the situation in the Asia Pacific, not just on rare earths, but Taiwan, all of it. We have a lot of potential allies in the region: China, South Korea, the Philippines. Canada could be a valuable ally, the European Union, Britain. Problem is, he's tariffed all of them. So, I think that one big lesson from this is that you have to identify who your real rivals are and who do you think is the threat that you need to be paying the most attention to, and then pay attention to that. And one of the real problems that Trump is starting to run into in a big way is that on so many of the issues that came up in this conversation with Xi, particularly on rare earths, but also on issues like Russian oil purchases or sanctions or any of the rest of it, alliances are really valuable, and yet the Trump trade policy is working against that.
Excellent point, Joe. All right, let's turn to another big economic issue this week, and that is the Federal Reserve decision on Wednesday to reduce its target interest rates, its short-term interest rate, to a range between 3.75% to 4%, from 4 to 4.25%. Let's listen to Chairman Jerome Powell talk about it.
At today's meeting, the committee decided to lower the target range for the federal funds rate by a quarter percentage point to 3.75% to 4%. Higher tariffs are pushing up prices in some categories of goods, resulting in higher overall inflation. A reasonable base case is that the effects on inflation will be relatively short-lived, a one-time shift in the price level. But it is also possible that the inflationary effects could instead be more persistent, and that is a risk to be assessed and managed. Our obligation is to ensure that a one-time increase in the price level does not become an ongoing inflation problem.
Alicia, the chairman said that they cut rates because they're worried about the jobs market. But the Fed's target for inflation is 2%. And he conceded that actual inflation over the last 12 months is 2.8%. And that includes the so-called core rate, not including volatile food and energy prices. So let's get this straight. Cutting rates, even though the inflation rate is still above the target, right move?
No, I don't think so. But I think part of the problem is they had led markets to expect a rate cut. They didn't want to disappoint markets, and markets were nevertheless disappointed by the chair.
But less modestly. So.
Yeah, right, because they I think correctly inferred a more hawkish policy going forward, and perhaps that a rate cut is not guaranteed in December, like many were expecting. I think part of the problem is, yes, the labor market slowing, job market. Fewer employers are creating fewer jobs. You don't see mass layoffs. I mean, maybe you're starting to hear a little more, like the Amazon announcement this week. But the unemployment rate, by all most measures, is still relatively low,
4.2 or 4.6, I think.
Now.
Yeah.
Historically speaking. And the issue is that the Fed actually has a lot more control over inflation or monetary policy than it does over the job market, which is really more impacted. I mean, there's economic cycles, but also, tariff, regulatory policy, tax policy. And so the Fed is saying that we're actually going to prioritize or focus more on the labor market and jobs than we are on inflation. And I think that that's probably the wrong balance to strike.
Well, yeah, it's I tilt towards that view myself, Alicia. Though 0.25, 25 basis points is not an enormous cut. And the hawkish soundings towards December, Joe, did sound from the chairman's press conference that there are other hawkish voices in the Federal Open Market Committee, including one Fed president from Kansas City Fed who dissented from the rate cut. And of course, on the other hand side, Steve Myron, who is the president's recent nominee, had been on the president's Council of Economic Advisors and is likely to return there. He dissented the other way, said it should have been a 50 basis point cut. So the Fed is seeing some significant internal disagreement. There's real confusion there, I think, or at least lack of clarity about which is the bigger problem, inflation or jobs. And as it was interesting to hear Powell use an analogy. He said, "What do you do when you're driving in a fog? You slow down." I think he was referring to the fact that they don't have enough data from government figures because of the shutdown. But I think there's a bit of intellectual fog here on the part of the Fed and its inflation models.
Yeah, I mean, so they have a bunch of issues that are combining to exacerbate this fog that they're in. So, I mean, Paul, you hinted at one of them, which is this model issue, the spreadsheets and formulas that they use to try to understand what is happening in the economy and how they think that their policies will affect that. We have a lot of evidence that those models have broken down. So, I mean, even if they could see clearly, if there were no fog, something would still be going awry with the steering on the car that they're driving. It would be hard for them to stay on the road. And so, once you separate out that problem, it only goes downhill. Because I think that you do have this tension, which Powell hinted at he didn't hint, he said it outright in his press conference, this growing tension between the two parts of the mandate that they have from Congress, which is full employment on the one hand, price stability on the other. And what they are seeing is increasing risks on both of those sides. And kind of like the proverbial donkey stuck between the two bales of hay, they aren't sure exactly which one to go for. And I have some sympathy for that dilemma because that is fundamentally a political decision. You have to decide on behalf of hundreds of millions of American voters and households which pain people will find more tolerable if they have to choose. Do they prefer more unemployment and a somewhat slower economy, or do they prefer the inflation? And the Fed isn't really set up to make that kind of decision. It's intended to be a technocratic body. And I think that they're now caught in the situation where there is this tension between the two parts of the mandate. What they need is some kind of guidance from Congress or the White House about which of those things they should be prioritizing. And instead, what they're getting is this perennial sniping from President Trump's Truth Social account. So I think that they do have a dilemma that's partly of their own making because they cling to a lot of these models that are not very effective. But it's also partly been foisted on them by the combination of this really complicated economic environment and this tension between the two mandates that they got from Congress.
Joe, they're the scariest words I've ever heard from you. The Fed needs guidance from the White House on which of these problems to address. I will say that it's the last thing I think the Fed needs at this juncture is guidance from this White House on monetary policy, because we know what that guidance will be. Cut rates, cut rates, cut rates, cut rates. The president has already said they should be 250 basis points lower. And if that were the case, I think they'd end up with more inflation, which would be counterproductive to the president's own goals and the president's promise during his campaign to reduce inflation and to lift real incomes, Alicia. This is what I'm on a soapbox here, but I think that the president campaigned and won largely. I mean, won on the border. He won on the sense of general disorder in the world, but he won on real incomes not rising, on the Biden inflation. He's the antidote to inflation. So if real incomes don't go up, and they haven't been because inflation has stayed stubborn at about 3%, then the average voter is going to say, hey, what happened? I'm still paying more than I thought I was supposed to, I'm still getting sticker shock in the vegetable aisle.
Which is actually a big place where where Americans are seeing it, and that's in part also, by the way, because of the tariffs. I think you're completely right. Americans voted for Trump to kind of revive the economy because they remembered his first term, where you actually had below 2% annual inflation during that time. And you could debate why that was, but you also had plentiful jobs that actually increased real wages, after inflation. And they thought that his policies could revive that. But he is actually taken from partly a separate course in his second term, which with focusing on the tariffs. I mean, they did pass the tax bill, which had some modest pro-growth policies in it. But he hasn't really focused on lifting real incomes. He's participated a little more in the grievance politics, or maybe his vice president has, which is what the left likes to focus on, inequality and all that, and the big companies or pharmaceutical companies there to blame. He's tried to use a little more regulation than he did during his first term as well. So I think, and that's why you see the poll numbers, the voters generally disapprove of his handling of the economies, that they're not seeing inflation come down. They're not seeing their wages increase.
That's the scariest number if I were the president and his pollsters looking at where he is in the approval of his economic management. I think that the tax bill and some of his deregulation is going to help in 2026 with the economy. But let's hope that this Fed move isn't premature and isn't going to cause sticky inflation, and we can get back to under 2% inflation and rising real wages. All right. Thank you, Joe Sternberg. Thank you, Alicia Finley. We'll leave it there. We'll leave it there for today. Thank you all for listening. We are here every day on Potomac Watch.